Okay, this is going to be our second lecture on Zionism, and I think I can do full screen here. And I'm going to just pick up where I left off last time. I'm limited to 15 minutes on the YouTube videos, so I'm going to just do them in 15-minute increments, unless I choose to use Blackboard. So I left off with Chaim Weizmann. Let's go over him again a little bit. Weizmann was educated in German and Swiss universities. He was actually from the Russian Empire, but he was from a Jewish settlement. He became a doctor of chemistry and then went on to become a professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester in England in 1904. And that's important because he will play a leading role, as I say in the notes there, in voicing support for Zionism. And he also helped invent, it wasn't dynamite, but a form of explosive that was used. You can look that up. So if you look at Weizmann, Chaim Weizmann, and some type of chemical used in explosives that was used during World War I and afterwards. So Weizmann's an important fellow. He becomes very connected to the British government. He promotes Zionism, and he is one of the reasons why the Balfour Declaration is given. It is pronounced in 1917. So it's difficult to overstate his importance. So I have a quote here from Weizmann. I'll just read it to you while you look at it. A state cannot be created by decree, but by the forces of a people, and in the course of generations. Even if all the governments of the world gave us a country, it would only be a gift of words. But if the Jewish people will go build Palestine, the Jewish state will become a reality, a fact. You can see when that was there. So Weizmann actually did go to the negotiations after World War I. He participated in those negotiations and promoted, of course, the Zionist cause at those negotiations. Here he is standing with Faisal. You should know who Faisal is, right? Faisal ibn Hussein, who later became king of Iraq and fought with the British during the war, right? So here he is standing with Faisal. Initially, they did have an agreement. Faisal did agree initially that in 1919 that Jews would be able to move into the Palestinian area. But that agreement pretty much ended in Faisal's mind when the French and the British didn't allow them to set up their independent Arab state in Syria as they had desired, which would have included Palestine, by the way. So, after 1920, with the British Mandate, the British had control over Palestine, right? And that's the real key here. Here you have the British Mandate again. Remember that Transjordan ends up going to... I'm blanking on the guy's name. It's a guy you should have to know for your test. You're having the brother of Faisal gets Transjordan, and that goes on to become Jordan, right? So the other side is what is Palestine, and in that area of what is Palestine is where the Jewish settlements will be. So what was the British Mandate in relation to Palestine? This guy, Herbert Samuel, was the first civilian high commissioner over the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, it's significant. He was British, but he was also Jewish, and he was also a Zionist himself. So he promoted the Jewish cause early on in Jewish settlements in Palestine as British High Commissioner, which is very significant. The League of Nations after World War I also gave formal sanction to create a Jewish homeland and promote the Zionist cause. Many of the Arab inhabitants at that time became very alarmed and were not happy because also the League of Nations recognized both the Balfour Declaration and they declared Hebrew one of the official languages of Palestine. So what role did Herbert Samuel play early on? As I said, he was a Zionist himself. he stated at the Paris Peace Conference that he wanted, so he had participated in earlier things, Palestine to be as Jewish as England was English. And he wanted a national home for the Jews there. He was very clear about it. And but remember this, during this time, in the early 20s, there were over 600,000 Arabs there. We'll say over 600,000 Arab inhabitants. And they made up 85% of the population at that time. Okay? So how was Britain going to facilitate a Jewish national home on one hand, and, as they said they would, protect the rights of the Arab majority on the other? And this was their constant problem throughout the Mandate period, which lasts 28 years, till the end, really till the after World War II. So it was very difficult, and those difficulties remain to this day, right? As more Jewish settlers come in, with the expansion of Jewish settlement, we're going to see eventually that's going to become Israel, but that's later. So, in 1922, Herbert Samuel had written, he partially wrote this and had a team that wrote it, called a white paper in 1922, and basically he created the policy of dual obligation. So it's this attempt to try to balance the Jewish Zionist cause with the Arab community. And they said in this white paper, it explicitly stated that creating a Jewish national home would not mean the imposition of Jewish nationality upon the inhabitants of Palestine as a whole. However, the white paper also said, it also gave in to certain Zionist demands by declaring that the Jewish people had a right to be in Palestine and that Palestine should become a center in which the Jewish people as a whole would take pride in the grounds of on the grounds of their religion and race. So it really didn't do a lot to clear anything up. This attempt to try to create the policy of dual obligation was essentially he tried to bring a government together, that would consist of all the people that lived there. So he tried to get a constitution written in 1922. He proposed a constitution in 1922, and it called for a legislative council composed of Muslims, Christians, and Jews that would be represented in this council and nominated by the High Commissioner. But the Arab leaders basically just refused to participate in this at all. Okay, and that was very significant. He tried to go ahead and have elections, but the Arab community completely boycotted these elections, and they made up a vast majority of the people, of Christians and Muslims, by the way. And the constitutional plan was completely shelved. So his idea of 1922, this constitution, this advisory legislative council, made up of Christians, Arabs, and Jews, Jewish leaders, would never happen. He did try to create an advisory council, though, even without the legislative council, right? And this failed also. So all these plans failed because there was never Arab cooperation. Well, that's one perspective to look at it. The reasons why the Arabs wouldn't cooperate is because they saw it as a imposition upon them from the beginning. That's the way they saw it. So essentially, what you had occur was two communities develop alongside each other in Palestine, and we're going to see in the 1920s and 30s more waves of Jewish settlers coming in, right? And World War II obviously is going to have a huge effect on what happens to bring about the state of Israel. We'll be talking about that more later. So, who was in charge of the Arab communities in Palestine, right? Well, you had to go back to, just like we saw in other places, the notables. Remember, in Syria and in Iraq, you had Arab notables. These were the educated, elite families of the Arab world who had had connections to the Ottoman Empire in the past. And you have the same situation exist in Palestine. Okay? They created, in 1920, their own organization called the Palestinian Arab Congress. Or actually, the Palestinian Arab Congress existed previous to 1920, and that Congress created the Arab Executive. Okay, but most of this came about during World War One or right after World War One. Okay, and so they elected this Palestinian Arab Congress was basically made up of representatives from these notable families, and they created what is called the Arab Executive. And the Arab Executive claimed to basically represent all Palestinians. And the British simply refused to recognize this group. Okay? The British attitude basically undermined the Arab Executive completely as an effective channel of communication because the British did not recognize this group. However, most Arabs did in Palestine. Okay? So this is important. Now the early leader of this group was the guy you see in the picture there. His name was Musa Kazim al-Husseini, and he was the president of the Arab Executive. This organization did not outlast him, though. It was very much connected to him as a personality. And ultimately, it was not able to gain mass support over time. It did not have staying power, and that's why it went away with him. But it was the first real attempt by Arabs in Palestine to have their own governing body. One of the problems among Arabs was their own rivalries. Their rivalries among their own families and factions. So what you'll see is actually various Arab groups emerge that are often at odds with each other as much as they are with the Jewish or the British groups. And this tends to be a thing that is constantly held Arabs back for a long time. The Jews, we'll see they had rivalries too, but they will be much more organized over time, and also they will put aside the rivalries for the sake of winning, essentially. And I think that's a big difference between the two groups. There are other differences too. We're going to see why that happened. So, another leader who was very significant in the early Arab movement is the guy you see in the picture there. His name was Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Notice the name is similar to the gentleman we just saw. And he occupied the most prestigious religious position in Palestine. And that was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was responsible for regulating Islamic affairs within the Greater Jerusalem district. And when the Ottoman Authority disappeared after World War I, you had the creation of the Palestinian Mandate, of course. The British expanded this guy's jurisdiction to include all of Palestine. Okay? And it gave him an office of a lot of influence. So in 1922, he was elected also president of the Supreme Muslim Council. Let me say a little bit about him before I move on. He was a native of Jerusalem. He studied in Cairo at the Al-Azhar school. We mentioned that before, religious school. But he also studied at the Imperial War College in Istanbul. He served in the Ottoman army during World War I. He was an officer. This guy you're looking at right here was an officer in the Ottoman army. And he was not happy with the Balfour Declaration at all. From the very beginning, Haji Amin al-Husseini was an anti-Zionist. He saw this as a problem for Arabs and did not like it. So that kind of tells you what's going to happen, right? Or what his position is going to be over time. So he was elected president, as I said, of the Supreme Muslim Council in 1922. And so he had a lot of authority. He had twin authority, one as the Mufti of Jerusalem, religious authority, and two as political authority. Now, generally, he's actually considered a moderate. And maybe we'll see some differences with different groups in the future. But he was always a strong opponent of Zionism from the very beginning. Now, this position of president of the Muslim Council and the religious position gave him a lot of authority over appointing officials, judges, controlling charitable donations. We talked about the WAGF before, WAGF, and so forth. And so I think we can kind of see the different sides here. Let me show that. Until 1936, he